Greetings, folks, and welcome to the show today. I'm Conrad Carnegie, your host. I'm delighted to have with me Brian Kaylor, who is the co-author of a book called Baptizing America. Brian, you wrote this with Beau Underwood, and it's a fascinating look at, January 6th. And it challenges some of our assumptions about what happened January 6th, the diagnosis that so many who've been writing about Christian nationalism have said about January 6th. Why don't you talk about the origins of this book for you and Beau, and then talk a little bit about the thesis. And I've got some questions for you.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on to talk about the book. I really appreciate it. And it's great to talk with you again. You know, this book came out of a long, several years process of Beau and I having conversations about Christian nationalism. We've been writing about Christian nationalism at our Substack newsletter, A Public Witness. And as we were writing about Christian nationalism and its current iterations, we kept realizing that a lot of the people who espouse Christian nationalism today, the kind of classic conservative white evangelical leaders that you can think of when you think of Christian nationalism, Speaker Mike Johnson, pseudo-historian David Barton, Tony Perkins, Sean Foyt, all these, figures that when they would try to make a historical claim to prove that we should be a Christian nation and that we were in fact intended to be a Christian nation, they kept pointing to things that had actually been put in place, like under God and the Pledge of Allegiance and God do we trust as the national motto. These things had actually been put in place by mainline Protestants, and in some cases by some fairly progressive mainline Protestants. And so it can be cathartic for us to, point at white evangelicals and say, well, look at them, look at their problems, look at how dangerous they are with Christian nationalism, all of which is true. But that doesn't actually get us to the root cause of how we got here. So those conversations ultimately led to us exploring this more, working on this book. And honestly, once we got into it, we started finding a whole lot more examples than we expected to.
So I teach a course on sociology of religion, and one of the things we always talk about is civil religion. And civil religion, as Bella would have defined it, sociologist Robert Bella, goes way before evangelicalism. It goes back to the way that church was brought into the state and state into the church. And you actually have two sections of your book that are titled that. Something about the introduction of the church to the state and the state to the church. So to what degree is this, and civil religion is the bringing together of God, country, nation, state. It's a kind of generic deity. It's not really Jesus. It's not really God in the way that we so often define God as Protestants or evangelicals or Catholics. So just talk a little bit more about the specific connections of what we're seeing today to this earlier form of civil religion, God and country, and so on.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the probably the chapter we struggled the most with in articulating in the book, because it's such an important conversation to think about civil religion and Christian nationalism. Scholars have often kind of pitted those two as different concepts, right? So that, civil religion is this unifying use of God language and it brings the nation together. And then Christian nationalism is the polarizing, divisive, use of a sectarian faith in the public square. And we don't think that line it works quite as cleanly as that civil religion actually isn't as innocent as it's often portrayed. And this is for a couple of reasons. So one, we unpack in the book is the demographic shift in our nation. So, when Robert Bella wrote his first essay on civil religion in 1967 is when it comes out, 92% of Americans identify as Christian and another 3% are Jewish. And so, this under God language, just generic God language, really did unify almost all of America. That doesn't work anymore today. Now, only 68% of Americans identify as Christian. So now we have a third of Americans, and we all know this from this. I'm sure you teach this, and there's so much literature out there about the rise of the nuns. NONES, those that are unaffiliated. We got 21% of Americans now identify with no religious tradition and faith. And so if civil religion did work as a unifying concept when Robert Bella was talking about it, that doesn't happen. It doesn't work anymore. civil religion today would look like Christian nationalism. It would be divisive. It would be polarizing. It would come out as more sectarian. But the other thing that I would say about civil religion is that it was never as innocent as it seemed. That sure, there was this 3% of Americans, only 3% that identified with another faith, and only 2% identified as no faith at all. But that was still significant to define them out of the American construct, essentially, right? That they were not part of this under God, civil religion. And so while they were a very small minority, it was problematic to define them, to civically excommunicate them as if they're not really American enough because they aren't a Christian or they don't believe in a God. And so we think civil religion is at best a gateway drug to Christian nationalism, or maybe it's a softer, cuddlier, friendlier version of Christian nationalism, but it's still Christian nationalism.
I hadn't thought about it as a gateway drug, but that's an interesting concept. Um, so there were still differences. I mean, so prior to Bella, you had the Great Awakenings that were happening in this country. You had the social gospel that some on both left and right embraced to some degree for a while. Can you go a little deeper and talk about where how this developed in the American story? And then I want to talk with you a little bit about, for a long time, the Senate, the Congress was largely made up of Protestant mainliners. And then that disappears. And now, if they're Christian, it's largely evangelical. What happened to the Mark Hatfields, for example, and others who, seem to be Christian, but were moderate and so on. But let's go back a little bit deeper beyond Bella and talk to me about how that history impacts where we're at today.
Yeah, I mean, so we have throughout American history these kind of waves of Christian nationalism, if you will,
Mhm.
and they kind of they bubble up and then they go away. I mean, we could look at some of the colonial era where there is you see, some colonies have state established churches, and a lot of our First Amendment religious freedoms come out of kind of a reaction to that established church. And so we're clearly not founded as a Christian nation. This is something historians have been very clear on. In fact, in many ways, our religious language in the Constitution is a response to what we might today call a Christian nationalism or a Christian colonialism approach. But in this book, we particularly focus on what we see in the late 1940s and then throughout the 1950s. This is when we have this Christian nationalism revival. It's a heavy wave that crashes in on the nation. And so this is when all of these things are happening at the same time. The creation of the National Prayer Breakfast, Under God and the Pledge, In God We Trust as our national motto. There's all of these things are happening, and it's happening at a time when mainline Protestants are the dominant religious tradition. They're the largest religious tradition in America. Their clergy are in influential positions in American society. And as you noted, most of the politicians in Congress are coming from the mainline Protestant traditions. And so when they envisioned the United States being a Christian nation, they saw it as being them. Right? This is a mainline Protestant Christian nation that we are in charge, that we are leading this country. And so I think that's what we see happening as to where all this is coming from. But then, as you already noted, we also start to see this really significant shift in American life. Late 1960s, early 1970s, we have the rise of evangelicals who go from being this distant third religious demographic after the mainline Protestants and Catholics for decades. And then evangelicals have always been this kind of small tradition, and they rise to become the largest religious group in the United States. It's in the late 1960s where I think this is, dramatized with, you see the Southern Baptist Convention, evangelical denomination surpassing the United Methodist Church, one of the key mainline Protestant denominations, as the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. Time magazine famously called 1976, as Jimmy Carter was running for office, the year of the evangelical. And I think that they were only partially wrong. It was really more of the start of the era of the evangelical. It wasn't just a year. And so that's, I mean, this as someone who teaches sociology of religion, there are significant differences between the evangelical tradition and the mainline Protestant tradition in how people talk about their faith, how they live out their faith, how they view their faith commitments towards their neighbors and others. And so it really does matter that we became a different kind of Protestant nation. And then what happened then is as white evangelicals entered into Congress, as they entered into these influential positions in society, they then picked up a lot of the trappings that mainline Protestants had helped build, the infrastructure between church and state, and have now been using it for their own political power and influence.
So did the white Protestant politician go extinct?
I mean, the white mainline Protestant, yeah, politician is I mean, on the way out the door. I mean, and it is interesting. We have this the rise of the white evangelicals, or they identify as non-denominational, something you see a lot with Congress, which is just another way of usually that's just evangelical, and they're just not, identifying a specific tradition. But yeah, and I think as you see, you mentioned like a Mark Hatfield or kind of a moderate, mainline Protestant type, politician. We do see that gone, right? So we have Catholic politicians. We have a lot more Catholic politicians and Supreme Court justices, for instance, than we had in the 50s and 60s. And so that's significant. But you see a Catholic tradition on both sides. You have the white evangelical tradition that's so strong on the Republican Party. But on with the Democratic Party, it's really more of the Black Christian that is the base of the religious voice that you're seeing there. I mean, look at in the United States Senate, you have a couple of ministers, Senator Langford, a white evangelical for the Republicans, and Reverend Senator Raphael Warnock, a Black Democrat. And so, that those are your religious voices that are dominating right now in Congress.
So I interviewed Jim Wallace for False White Gospel. Can you tell me, and again, I read very, very quickly through your book, but where's race in all of this, and where's race in your book in all of this as a factor? Is it, if not, why not? Just can you talk about the racism piece a bit?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because it is important, and Jim's book is also excellent in thinking about white Christian nationalism today. And it is important that when we talk about Christian nationalism, we really do mean white Christian nationalism. The sociology research is significant in showing the connections between those that espouse Christian nationalism and then also holding racist ideas or backing policies that discriminate against racial minorities. So there's a real correlation there in those ideologies. And I also think that just philosophically it makes sense, right? So Christian nationalism said we were founded to be a Christian nation. And if that's true, it was really founded to be a white Christian nation because, we were founded with genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of Black Africans. And so, I mean, that doesn't sound very Christian to me, but if it was a Christian, it was a Christian society only for white male Christians. And so white Christian nationalism doesn't privilege all Christians. It really only privileges a narrow slice of Christianity, and particularly the white male cisgendered heterosexual Christian. That's who really gets the place of privilege. And so, yeah, the racism is embedded there in Christian nationalism.
So, Brian, there are a lot of books coming out on a white Christian nationalism, that theme. How does your book, how does your book differentiate itself from those other books? That's the first question. Secondly, is there is there a longer is there a short shelf life or a long shelf life to this genre? Because we've got Trump running in 24, and let's assume he loses. Does all this go away? Let's assume he wins. What happens? But I'm not asking you to speak to the shelf life of all of the books, but yours goes way back and has a long shelf life in its memory, and would seem to me has some shelf life thereafter because this is not going to go away. So just some reflections on the future of this genre, of this focus on white nationalism right now.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because I will note that I think this book is unlike any other coming out right now on Christian nationalism. You're right. I mean, there's probably going to be 100 titles. I mean, maybe more than that, but let's say 100 like well-known good titles on Christian nationalism that come out this year, and 99 of them will focus on evangelicals and or Pentecostal, charismatic, apostolic Reformation type of Christians promoting Christian nationalism, and ours looks at mainline Protestants, the other half of the Protestant world. So, we have all of these books and I mean, some phenomenal books that are coming out right now on Christian nationalism. I mean, you already mentioned Jim Wallace. There are several others that I've been reading that are great. Tim Alberta, Sarah McCammon, others that have new books coming out on Christian nationalism. Andrew Whitehead had American Idolatry last year. That's fantastic. But they're all focused on thinking about evangelicals and Pentecostal Christians. And if you look at the PRI data now, we talked earlier about the rise of evangelicals. Now evangelicals are in the steep decline. Most of the nuns are coming out of that kind of ex-evangelical world. And so PRI actually finds that mainline Protestants and evangelicals are about the same size again. And yet half of the Protestant world is being completely ignored. So that's the first thing, is why this book is completely different. I think people should pick up this book because it tells the other side of the story, the other half of the Protestant world. Yeah, and the shelf life question is really important. And one of the things that we make really clear in the beginning of the book is that white Christian nationalism is not a Trumpian problem. It didn't show up with Trump, and it's not going to go away with Trump. When Trump is off the scene, whether that's this year, whether that's 4 years, whenever Trump is off the scene, white Christian nationalism won't go away because he didn't create it. And we're doing this deep dive on the history that shows that it predates his rise. It predates the political rise of white evangelicals. And so it's a problem we're going to have for a while. It's a heresy we're going to have for a while. And if we want to truly capture the problem, if we want to truly make a difference, we have to know how we got here. And too many people today, I think, well, if we can just get Trump off the scene, then we've solved this problem. And that's not going to do it. So I hope this book has a long shelf life. I think it will, because we have that warning that this is not about Trump. This is about something much bigger.
I was going to ask you, Brian, what's the antidote to this problem that we've got that's been with us as long as this country's existed? Is there an antidote to it?
I mean, I think there is. We think there is. As Christian ministers, we think the gospel teaches that Jesus's words show us something that's not a gospel of nationalism. The temptation of power and empire is always there. And so we have to learn how to detox. And one of the things we actually hope with this book, we end with some really practical notes for mainline pastors and lay leaders and those in other Christian traditions of how can you make a difference to detox from Christian nationalism in your own church and in your own faith tradition. And I think that's the answer. That's what it's going to take. It's not something we're going to defeat in the ballot box. Christian nationalism won't be destroyed there. It didn't start there. And so we have to do that difficult work of unwinding Americanism and Christianity, because, if you grew up in a white Christian church in the US, Christian nationalism is just in the air you breathe. It just seems natural. And so we have to figure out, wait, well, what was American? Jesus didn't actually say that. How do we start to unwind that? And so, yeah, I do think there is hope. I do think, but it's going to be difficult work, and it's going to be conversations that have to happen in churches. And we think a lot of the moderate, progressive, mainline congregations are exactly the churches that should want to do this work, that should want to tackle Christian nationalism, but maybe they didn't realize that they need to not just point fingers outside, but actually see what they can do in their own context.
Yeah, those who remain, right, from that tradition. When I was talking with Walter Brueggemann about the dismantling of the church, he said, well, white mainline Protestants knew the jig was up sooner than evangelicals did. But as you said, there's been this decline. This is a really interesting book. And I'm a Mennonite, retired Mennonite pastor. And so I was intrigued by you at least once mentioned Mennonites. And, the Mennonites take Matthew 5 seriously. You were comparing Liz Cheney in that piece. And one of the struggles, Brian, that I've had with all of the focus on white Christian nationalism, and I haven't said much about it publicly, is that, 15 years ago, 16, 17 years ago, I was calling, as well as my historian friend John Roth, who was at Goshen College, for Mennonites to simply pull back from politics, to take a Sabbath from voting. That went over like a lead balloon. But in some ways, it seems to me that is a kind of antidote. And for those of us who grew up Mennonite, this whole connection between church and state at all is a disconnect. Our ancestors didn't take up the sword, nor did they want to be protected by the sword. And so I have personally struggled to know how to, as you said, it's not just a ballot box issue. And so if we get on board with this as a ballot box issue alone, it seems to me that's not about Christian transformation. You want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I have a great appreciation for the Mennonite tradition. I think we've talked about this before. I was a member of a Mennonite USA church in Virginia for several years, and honestly, that context, that books that I've read, and being in that church was a big part of the process for me in helping, recognize the Christian nationalism in the tradition that I grew up in, detoxing and beginning that journey. So it's been really important. And we do know Mennonite church, Mennonites, a time or two in the book, technically labeled by scholars and researchers a mainline Protestant denomination, and yet really significantly different. Doesn't come with a lot of the baggage that a lot of the other mainline traditions have. Don't have the history like Episcopalians of being a state church. And I also think that there's some important theology in the Mennonite tradition that could be helpful for the church writ large. Whether that be, as you talked about with the pulling back and more of a willingness in that tradition than you would find even with others, the belief in church state separation, the pacifism, because what's really important there is Christian nationalism is so tied to war. We talk about this in the book, that war fuels Christian nationalism. It's that rally around the flag idea that infects the churches during times of war. But then also Christian nationalism makes us more likely to go to war. And that's particularly a danger to the church, to the church's witness, because it teaches us to root for our soldiers as God's army while we go and kill maybe Christians on the other side of the border. And so I think there's a lot that's there in the historic peace churches that could help us as an antidote to Christian nationalism. But yeah, this idea of a Sabbath from the political engagement is significant in this idea of at least recognizing that that's not where salvation will come from. That we give too much emphasis, we give too much credit to our politicians, that we think that voting, that's our sacred duty, and now I've done my responsibility for the 2 years or 4 years, and there's nothing else I have to do. And as we note in the book, I mean, the steps that we give people to do in the last chapter on Christian nationalism aren't about voting. It's about a lot of other work that you're going to have to do in your own congregation and in your own community.
This is a really powerful book, and I just really want to highly recommend it to our listeners. I did do a little piece called "The 10 Reasons Christian Nationalism Isn't Our Main Problem" or something like that. But it's a lot of the things that you bring up in the book, that we've got deeper issues, deeper problems in the church, and when we take our eyes off the ball and focus it on just Christian nationalism, white nationalism, I think we've missed the gospel. So, Brian, thank you so much for the work you and Beau have done on this. Where can people get this book? When does it come out? Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate everything you just said about the book. It officially launches June 4th. If you go ahead and pre-order, the publisher will probably be sending out some of the copies early. And so that's exciting to see those start to sprinkle out hopefully soon. You can find it wherever you buy books. If you go to chalicepress.com and use the promo code BA podcast, so BA for Baptizing America, BA podcast, they'll give you 33% off. Also have some links and other information about the book, a study guide at our website, publicwitness.wordandway.org. That's publicwitness.wordandway.org, and hit the little tab that says Baptizing America, and you'll find more information there.
Brian, it's always fun to talk to you because it seems like we just always connect right where we left off, and there's a lot we have in common when it comes to, I think, faith, but also our understanding of religious history in America. Thank you for being a guest today. And I will post this, listeners, to my YouTube channel, and there will also be some information coming out. If you're not on my mailing list, send me an email, carnegie.conrad@gmail.com, and I'll be glad to put you on. It may show up on Facebook. We'll make sure it gets lots of airplay. Brian, thank you for being part of this. And it's delightful to have you with us.
Thanks, Conrad.